Hello, History 103. Good to see you. This is a short video. As I said last week, filming this on Monday, Indigenous Peoples Day, so of course we don't have class this week, um, or this day, I should say. Zoom class today on Monday. So I just want to talk for just a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. If you remember, that's where we left off at the very end of last week. But before I do that, I just want to remind you all that we have our midterm exam this week. It's on Wednesday, the 14th. And so what I'll do is on Wednesday morning at 10 a.m., I will release the exam on Blackboard, and I'll send out an email telling you that I've done that. And you can take as many attempts as you want. You can open it and start it and then come back to it. That's no problem. But you need to have uploaded the essays that I'm going to ask you to write by the end of the day, Thursday, the 15th. So I'll close it at 11:59 p.m. So you have almost 2 full days to do the exam. As I said, this is just a very short video to sort of wrap up what we were discussing at the very end of last week. If you remember, and you can go to the slideshow that's on Blackboard called The American Revolution. We left off with a slide called the second slide that's entitled The Road to Revolution. And that ended with the Second Continental Congress's failed attempt to negotiate a peace with the British Empire, the so-called Olive Branch Petition, and the response by King George III, which is the very last point on that slide, in which the king declared the 13 colonies officially in rebellion. So this brings us to the end of the calendar year 1775. And as I said last week, just a couple of points to kind of keep in mind as we talk about the one slide that I'm going to talk about today. And it is this. It's that even as late as the end of 1775, there was still no consensus, still no general view that there should be an independent United States or an independent North American colonies. That was an idea that by the end of 1775, some people had begun to discuss. And yet, that was an idea that was still not inevitable, right? If you remember back to last week, the discussion of the perils of inevitability, right? Not assuming that there would be an independent United States. That's true as late as 1775. So I'm going to look at the slide now called The Coming of Independence. That begins to change, by which I mean the sense that there should be an independent United States begins to change in early 1776, most importantly, the publication of a pamphlet by a man named Thomas Paine called Common Sense. And as you can see on the slide called The Coming of Independence, that was released or published in January 1776, January the 10th to be specific. So this pamphlet was wildly popular, almost from its immediate publication. Thomas Paine's an interesting figure. He'd actually only come to North America, to Philadelphia, less than 2 years before. He actually arrived in Philadelphia from England, where he was born and where he lived until 1774. He came at the very end of 1774, actually the end of November. So he'd really only been in North America for a little over a year and a couple of months. And he decided to write a pamphlet that would propose the idea of American independence, in part because he had a longer experience than many in North America had with the British Empire, by which I mean he'd had his entire life until 1776 living in England to see firsthand the workings of the British Empire. And he'd grown to disdain it for 2 reasons. One, he'd grown to disdain the idea of a monarchy and the idea of a hereditary aristocracy or hereditary nobility, right? People who are born into a higher social class than so-called common people simply because of to the parents to whom they were born. He also, and this is an important term, had come to believe in a political philosophy that was growing in interest and popularity in the 1770s. That's called republicanism. Republicanism, ISM. Just to be clear, that term doesn't have anything to do with the modern day American Republican Party. It's definitely very different. Republicanism, again, the philosophy that inspired Thomas Paine to write Common Sense, is, in brief, a political philosophy that argues that common people, or the people, can and should govern themselves through an elected a representative system for electing political representatives, and they did not need to be governed by a monarch or governed by a layer of hereditary aristocrats. So this idea, which we in the United States now take for granted, it was pretty radical for its time period. It was growing in popularity over the course of the 1770s. Many sort of famous American revolutionary leaders adopted this, like Thomas Jefferson, for example. Thomas Paine was really one of the most important exponents of this political philosophy of republicanism, and it is the key philosophy that he expressed in Common Sense. This pamphlet, Common Sense, was short. Initially, it was only a little over 40 pages and broken up into 4 sections. Inspired by this political philosophy of republicanism, Thomas Paine made a very simple and direct argument, and that is that the North American colonies should immediately declare independence. If they did not do so, they would have missed a golden opportunity to create a nation founded on the principles and the ideals of republicanism. So this pamphlet, as I said just a minute ago, was immediately very popular. It sold more than 100,000 copies in North America within 6 months. So that was a staggering amount for the time period. It also became popular in England. It was reprinted in England, reprinted in France, reprinted in more than a dozen different languages. So it immediately made Thomas Paine a sort of celebrity author. And the reason this was so popular, Common Sense, which, think about the title, right? Common Sense, so it's common sense to declare independence from Great Britain. The reason it was so popular is because he deliberately wrote the pamphlet in a way so that it would appeal to a very broad audience. He intended the pamphlet to be read by, or at least to have it understood by, the vast majority of people in North America, not just elites who had access to education. So this is what separated it from other writings from this time period. Up until Common Sense, most political writers, and I'll just throw a couple of names at you that you're familiar with. I've already mentioned one, Thomas Jefferson, another, John Adams, were writing pamphlets that were inspired by republicanism, that were critical of the British Empire, but they were written primarily to appeal to and to be read by highly educated sort of elite audiences. And Thomas Paine changed that concept with Common Sense. He specifically wanted this, as I said, to be read by a large, or at least understood by a large audience in North America. As I said, within 6 months, this pamphlet was extraordinarily popular, and it had a huge impact on public opinion in North America, which is to say that it convinced a lot of people, again, sort of common people, to support the idea of independence over the first 6 months of the year 1776. So it really swayed public opinion in favor. So much so, getting down to the second point, that the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, which, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, or this video, and as we talked about at the end of last week's Zoom session, the Second Continental Congress, as recently as 1775, had tried to negotiate through the Olive Branch Petition an end to hostilities between North America and Great Britain. But Common Sense was so popular and it swayed public opinion so much that the Second Continental Congress, which met in Philadelphia, where Thomas Paine lived and where Common Sense was published, Second Continental Congress began to consider independence. So over the course of spring 1776, which is a point you see on the slideshow, we see support within the Second Continental Congress for the Declaration growing. We see congressmen, they were, to be clear, all men, beginning to take seriously the idea. And in June of 1776, the Second Continental Congress decided to take that step, and they created a committee of 5 members whose job it was to draft a declaration. And that was a committee that was actually led by Benjamin Franklin, but the primary author of the Declaration of Independence was Thomas Jefferson. And so Thomas Jefferson, over the course of about a month, about 4 weeks, worked almost every day on a Declaration of Independence. And if you scroll down to the image just below this slide, you can see a manuscript page, a draft page of the Declaration of Independence, and you can see the edits, the lines being crossed out and language being inserted into it. So the drafting was interesting. It was written, as I said, by Thomas Jefferson, but it was edited by this committee of 5 people, which included Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. So they worked on this, as I said, for about 4 weeks, constantly reading Thomas Jefferson's work and then editing it, deleting things, making suggestions. You can kind of, again, see that on the image here, the corrections that are made to this particular copy of the draft. That handwriting is Thomas Jefferson's, by the way, if you're curious. He had very good handwriting, thankfully, for historians. And this process continued over the course of June of 1776, and it was completed, and a final draft was sent to the whole of the Continental Congress, where on July the 2nd, actually, they officially ratified it, accepted it, and therefore officially declared the 13 North American colonies independent. Independence Day is celebrated on July the 4th, however, because that's the day that the public was made aware of this declaration. So there was 2 days in between. In terms of the declaration itself, there's some, I think, famous, certainly in the United States, potentially in the world, some famous lines in the document that we'll keep talking about as we move forward, because they sort of, I think, reveal to historians both the idealism of the American revolutionaries, but also reveal some of the underlying contradictions or hypocrisies of the American Revolution in the stated reasons for declaring independence. And the most familiar language to most people who have read it is the first 2 paragraphs, where we have the famous lines. For example, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and that is gendered, but all men are created equal, and that we are, to paraphrase, declaring independence in pursuit, quote, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the 2 most famous passages, that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and that we're declaring independence in pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, those are very idealistic statements, and as we know, it's quite easy to question whether or not those beliefs were widely held. As we've talked about, for example, somebody like Thomas Jefferson was a contradiction, in part because he wrote these famous lines, all men are created equal, but at the same time was a slaveholder, owned other human beings, about 180 over the course of his life. The same was true of George Washington. There are many quote-unquote members of the founding generation that were slaveholders. So you might ask yourself, did they actually believe these things? Did they believe that all men are created equal? Did they think that women were in some way equal to men? And from our perspective in the 21st century, it's quite easy to say that no, they probably didn't believe those things entirely. So that kind of lofty, idealistic language is both idealistic, right, but also evidence of the kind of internal contradictions, right, in this document and in the beliefs of the founding fathers who declared independence and created the United States. Now, you might be wondering, what about Thomas Paine? In this context, well, Thomas Paine was not a slaveholder and never was a slaveholder, and actually was anti-slavery. So really a lot of the understanding of the hypocrisies and contradictions becomes clearest when we apply it to the slaveholders who declared independence, but not everybody was a slaveholder. Just to bring that up, it's worth mentioning. Thomas Paine wasn't. But the Declaration itself, aside from the very lofty language and discussion of inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if you've read the document before, you know that actually most of it, about 80% of it, is just a list of reasons. Right? These are the reasons why we're declaring independence from Great Britain. And they check down a lot of the things that we've already talked about. One of the things they mention, right, is the issue of taxation without actual representation in Parliament. They mention the ways in which the British Empire had oppressed the North American people by sending the military to occupy their towns and cities, right, as was the case in Boston, and by 1776 elsewhere. So they go down a pretty familiar list of reasons. And so that's really what the document is, right? The language that we know is really a short portion. It's the opening 2 paragraphs of a much longer document that is a laundry list. And that actually is an interesting thing to think about, because it's an important point to note who the actual audience for the Declaration of Independence was. Sometimes there's a tendency to think that the audience was the North American people, so that they could learn that their leaders had declared independence from Great Britain. That's maybe partially true, or that this is a document that was primarily intended for the leadership of the British Empire, the King, Parliament. That's also partially true, but the actual intended audience, interestingly enough to historians, was other countries besides Britain, because the North American revolutionaries, now we can call them revolutionaries truly, realized that they would need the support of other European countries in fighting a war for independence against the British Empire. So the list of reasons was really directed to other countries. Here are all the things that have happened for the previous 13 years. These are the reasons why we're declaring independence. These are the reasons why the British Empire has oppressed us. Please help us. Is really the intention of the Declaration of Independence. And as we'll see at the beginning of next week, after our midterm, I'll talk briefly just very quickly about the actual war for independence, and then we'll discuss the nation that was created by the war for independence. But as we'll see, the North American colonies, newly calling themselves the United States, by the way, a name created by Thomas Paine, the first person to write in print the United States of America. We'll see that the United States of America absolutely required the help of France in particular in order to secure independence. And had France not helped the new United States, there would not be a United States, an independent United States, at least in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So I'm going to stop there. Again, just wanted to talk a little bit about the Declaration of Independence. As I said last week, and as I said at the beginning of this video, your midterm will be up on Wednesday. You have through Thursday to complete it. And I'll send out an email with more instructions first thing Wednesday morning. Okay? Be well and have a good Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you.